The underground cave thrummed with quiet machinery and dripping water as cables snaked along the rock. Arthur checked a corroded junction box while Betty held a lamp steady, both focused and tired. The air carried the smell of damp stone and warm insulation, and their rubber boots squeaked on the metal grating. Arthur said birds are not real. Betty said he could believe whatever he liked as long as he fixed the network before morning. They had volunteered as the cave's community tech team because they were steady on ladders and cared about keeping messages reliable. Their elders had told a story about a siege that ended because both armies overslept, and that story lingered behind their work. They believed that good wiring avoided crises and kept rumors from turning into emergencies. Arthur said good infrastructure prevented misunderstandings like that siege. Betty said alarm clocks also helped. Posters warned of a secret book club revolt, but the threat looked more like neat annotations than violence. Pamphlets slid into technical manuals carried sassy corrections, and sticky notes dotted signs with exacting clarity. Arthur pretended not to notice, pocketing their tidy bookmarks for his toolbox. Arthur said nothing about the rebellion and tucked the bookmarks away. Betty laughed and said librarians were the true heroes of any siege. Above the central cavern, 2 emerald cockatoos watched from an iron balcony with calculated poise. Their glossy badges declared authority, and the pair moved like rivals who sharpened each other by accident. Arthur stared up and narrowed his eyes at the display. Arthur said those are definitely puppets. Betty said he should get his eyes checked. Susan's voice echoed as she boasted about their vibe-coded sight and promised an enforced abundance. Trudy added that choice would be mandatory for the greater good, their confidence ringing off stone. They basked in the power of being seen above everyone else, certain they could prove critics wrong by tightening the rules. Susan said everyone mocked our vibe-coded sight, but abundance is the future and we will enforce abundance. Trudy said choice would be mandatory for the greater good. Their plan unfurled with mechanical precision. 13 obsidian obelisks controlled basic services, and every function required all 13 logins. Missing one meant the pantry hatch stayed locked and daily life stalled. Patrols of enforcement parrots roamed with scanners, ready to find anyone who fell behind. Arthur said they were drones in bird suits. The consequences crept into every corridor, turning errands into tests. At the launch, blinking placards spat out new passwords while Arthur and Betty argued on the stairs. The crowd buzzed as the cockatoos watched for descent. Susan noticed them and curled her beak in contempt. Betty said we should file a complaint. Susan said dissent was a premium tier, and Trudy said the free tier came with approved opinions only. Before they could choose a response, their elderly neighbor Marnie arrived clutching a staticky portable TV. On its screen, royal blue horses trotted through snow-like interference that popped against the speaker. Betty's patience outlasted Arthur's skepticism, and the secret book club calmly relabeled a sign nearby with perfect glue. Marnie said aliens are sending me messages again. Betty said they would look. By evening, the authorities' grip tightened as lines wound around obelisks and families scrambled to keep birthdays and water flowing. Cheerful fines chimed through the cavern until the stone felt sore. Arthur frowned at the sound and muttered about budgets while Betty kept him aimed at the problem. Arthur whispered that puppets should not be allowed a jingle budget. Betty said focus. A sudden outage plunged the plaza into patchy darkness, and Arthur and Betty rushed for the control mast. Trudy and 2 guards intercepted them with scanners and cool smiles, making a show of authority. Susan appeared above to promise that critics would learn discipline through passwords. Trudy said their toolkit was confiscated for unauthorized fix-it behavior. Susan said critics would learn respect by memorizing 13 good passwords. They ducked into a side market where a vendor's TV flickered with a cooking show. A human Italian pizza chef tossed dough in a perfect circle, his hands moving with effortless rhythm no one else seemed to notice. Arthur stabbed a bypass plug into the wall while Betty typed, trying to slit past the obelisk's gatekeeping. The alarm howled before they finished, a mechanical wail that drew stares. Arthur said hold it steady and Betty said keep going, then the siren drowned them out. The failed patch made them obvious. and Trudy arrived with feathers bright and unforgiving to bloat about anomaly detection. They sprinted through a sluice culvert, water slapping their boots, then collapsed behind a curtain of stalactites, soaked and shaken. Silence held for a breath, heavy with the loss of their license to help. Arthur said we might have just lost our kiosk license. Betty said we did, and he had no comeback. Hopelessness pressed close as they pictured neighbors tripping over too many logins, while their own tools sat in confiscation. The cave felt lower, the stone heavier, and the problem suddenly dumber for how real it was. Arthur reached for his old refrain, and Betty cut him off with a threat that fit the slope of the tunnels. Arthur said if birds were real then this would feel less stupid. Betty said if he said birds were not real one more time she would roll him like a barrel. Betty left Arthur to sulk and went to Marnie's nook, where the portable TV now buzzed in a precise rhythm. 3 royal blue horses trotted in place and tapped their hooves in counted sets that repeated. Arthur arrived grudgingly and recognized the code buried in the pattern. Marnie said, "See, aliens." Arthur said the taps matched an old maintenance code, and Betty said, "Then we have a message. Trapped, need release, can jam." Quick interlude to keep this story going strong and growing. If you're enjoying the underground intrigue and clever teamwork, help the channel by tapping like and hitting subscribe so you do not miss what happens next. Drop a comment with the word slop to let the algorithm know you are on the team. Betty said leave the word slop so we can spot you in the crowd. They followed the coordinates to a sealed service shaft plastered with bureaucratic warnings. Behind it waited 3 royal blue horses steady, amused and swaggering, each wearing harness gear, one with a radio that buzzed softly. The trio bowed and explained how they had hijacked old TD loops to ask for help, then made a nearby obelisk hiccup with a careful rhythm and hum. Betty said this is Fenwick, Carl, and E-Money. E-Money said they could jam if released, and the obelisk flickered update pending on cue. Carl recalled that the cockatoos panicked when someone whispered pickle near their office, sending tablets flying. The horses confirmed it happened more than once, and Arthur paused at the odd vulnerability. Betty stitched the pieces together into a plan that could break the authorities' rhythm. Carl said he had whispered pickle as a joke and Susan had panicked. Betty said if the horses jam and we whisper pickle at the right moments, we can force mistake spirals. The horses agreed to join because the hedgehogs had decoded the message, opened the shaft, and treated them with respect. They described their skills, synchronized stomping and frequency modulation to jam all 13 services for short bursts. E-Money grinned about amplifying whispers until they rode the stone. Fenwick said teamwork was the only way out of this. E-Money said he could lift a whisper so the walls carried it to every feather. Arthur and Betty recruited quietly, asking Marnie to keep watch and enlisting 2 book club members mid-prank on a caution sign. The librarians lit up at being taken seriously and promised to plant decoy pamphlets and map stickers to steer families to safety. They also admitted a surplus of pickles that could be useful. Arthur said we need decoys and safe routes. A book club member said we have pamphlets, maps, and crates of pickles. By midnight festival time, the horses warmed up with rhythmic stomps that pulsed through the floor. Book club members drifted through the crowd, laying quiet trails of bookmarks toward shadowed exits where the hedgehogs would guide people. Tension hummed like insects, low and constant. Arthur said keep it steady and follow the markers. Betty said stay close and wait for the signal. On stage, Susan prepared to unveil a 14th login while Trudy struck a pose of control. Arthur repeated the plan out of habit, and Betty kept him focused. They were ready to catch emergency resets and cut off the keys if panic spread. Arthur said horses jam, obelisk stall, we whisper pickle, birds panic, they hit emergency resets, we revoke their admin keys. Betty said focus and remember the plan. Fenwick stomped, Carl followed, and E-Money slid a hum under the network like a lever, stacking update pendings across the obelisks. The crowd murmured as the lights fluttered. Betty moved to the steps with her wire coil while Arthur tuned the receiver for reset signals. Betty said now. Arthur said catching resets. Hold the jam. At the stairs, Betty whispered pickle so softly it barely disturbed the dust, and E-Money lifted it with a stone. Susan convulsed into panic and crashed into Trudy, badges clattering across the stage. Their orders collided, one for off and one for on, and their systems obeyed both by slamming emergency routines. Betty said pickle. Trudy shouted to turn everything off, and Susan shouted to turn everything on. Arthur caught the emergency resets, slammed a chalk-labeled button, and pushed a single command to unify services and revoke admin rights. The horses held the jam long enough for the order to travel through stubborn nodes. Librarians whispered pickle from safe cover, and the stage devolved into fallen lanyards and a tilted podium as the crowd sensed freedom. Arthur said siege lift and pushed the button. A book club member whispered pickle again for good measure. The cave council arrived with lanterns and a tidy list of charges, now connected by a sensible, single-channel alert. Susan tried to restart her speech about abundance, but a librarian's polite cough and the word pickle reduced it to a squeak. Trudy grabbed for a powerless scanner and looked small under the lights. Susan said abundance, and a librarian murmured pickle into a handkerchief. The council ordered them stripped of authority and assigned to shelve books. The night stretched long as Arthur, Betty, and the horses restored access tunnel by tunnel, merging services into one public library feed. Each reconnect made the cave feel taller and the air lighter. People stopped them in the halls with relief in their faces. A neighbor said thank you. Arthur breathed carefully as the gratitude made him dizzy, and Betty smiled with tired pride. With the revolt over, the book club set up a help desk and turned their bookmarks into official maps and their pamphlets into friendly quick start guides. They quietly handed pickle slices to those stationed near cockatoos to speed compliance with court orders. The plaza shifted from tension to cookies and calm. A librarian said maps here and help there. Another said pickles available if you are posted near birds. At the water channel with dawn lamps warming to amber, the two hedgehogs finally rested. The argument about bird reality softened into an admission that these particular birds had been a real problem. They laughed, and the weight eased from their shoulders. Arthur said whether or not birds were real did not change what these birds did. Betty said that sounded like he admitted birds existed, and he grumbled about organized feathers. Fenwick, Carl, and E-Money arrived with coats shining, offering to guard the network with regular stability pulses. They promised fast stamps for outages and monthly whisper drills to keep everyone coordinated. Arthur welcomed them formally to the team. Fenwick said they would pull stability checks twice a day. E-Money said whisper drills would keep the cave ready. Marnie wandered by with her portable TV now tuned to the unified feed, the screen a calm scroll of community notes. She declared there were no aliens today, and Betty teased that maybe the aliens were the friends they made. Marnie pretended not to hear and asked for horses as a screensaver. Marnie said no aliens today. E-Money said he could arrange royal blue horses trotting as a screensaver. In the reading hall, the council held a hearing with the book club seated like benevolent judges in the front row. When Susan and Trudy tried to revive their pitch, a librarian raised a jar and murmured pickle, and panic returned on cue. The council noted the reaction as proof of unfitness and finalized a long sentence of library duty and bans. A librarian said pickle in a measured voice. The council set public apology and permanent removal from network administration. Arthur led Betty past silent obelisks and wrote everything down in a fresh maintenance log. The plan that worked, the reasons it worked, and guardrails for future changes. Betty added whisper protocols and credited allies by name, including Marnie. They copied the record into the new public archive so history would not forget the details. Arthur said document the safeguards. Betty said give the horses, the club, and Marnie their due credit. The book club retired its revolt name and announced the open cave reading circle with a smile. They placed a tiny plaque on the central pillar reading Pickle Power, dedicated to community resilience. Arthur rolled his eyes and then laughed, and Betty said this was how revolutions should end. Jokes and better manuals. A librarian said welcome to the open cave reading circle. Betty said revolutions end best with a joke and better manuals. The emerald cockatoos learned shells and decimals the hard way, side by side with stern librarians who offered lists instead of vibes. There was no sympathy for their past choices. Each returned book reminded them that power served people. Their consequences would last, and they felt it in every aisle. Trudy grumbled about decimals. Susan tried to vibe code a spreadsheet until a librarian handed her a printed list and a stern look. The caves felt lighter under a single channel feed that delivered boring, dependable news. Alerts and reminders replaced chaos, and volunteers read a weekly story aloud. One night, Arthur listened to Betty read and finally let go of his bird argument in favor of teamwork. Arthur said teamwork was real either way. Betty elbowed him and said birds were real and he should leave it at that. On the Oversleeping Siege anniversary, the community celebrated with a reading marathon and a rhythmic stomp concert by the horses. Marnie screened a program of calm blue waves on her TV while applause echoed down the stone. Arthur fixed a squeaky hinge as Betty passed him a pickle and called it tradition. Betty said, "Consider it tradition." The crowd cheered as the hinge went quiet. From then on, whenever someone proposed a fussy service no one needed, a librarian's soft cough set off a chorus of pickle whisper for luck. It was not magic. It was a shared memory of choosing each other over spectacle. Arthur and Betty kept the wires neat, the horses kept the rhythm steady, and the book club kept the words honest. A librarian said pickle. The cave stayed awake in the right ways. All the slop in this video was generated using AI. This note is for clarity so you know how it was made. If you enjoyed the story, please like, subscribe, and comment the word slop to help others find it.